think embodiment work is really the only way, and this might sound dogmatic, but I do think it's like the only way we can build self-trust that's sustainable, because if you're not in your body, you're just spinning in your mind, and your mind's going to take you all kinds of places, like fear, old patterns. Oh, what did this person tell me to do? You know what I mean?
Welcome back to the Unbroken Chain podcast. I'm so glad to be in this space with you again. This week, we are hanging out with Emily Vino, who is a Portland, Oregon-based illustrator and healer and human design reader, which I'll explain a little bit more momentarily. I became aware of Emily's beautiful corner of the world, I think about 3 years ago, as an illustrator. And that's actually not something that we ended up talking about in this conversation really at all. But I had bought this awesome crop top that she screen printed that has a uterus and ovaries on it. I'd given it to my sister for Christmas a couple years ago. And I guess had started following her on Instagram after that. But it really wasn't until maybe the past 6 months that I started to notice that she was sharing these really personal stories on her Instagram about purity culture and her background growing up in evangelical Christianity and a lot of the healing that she's doing right now from religious trauma, Christianity trauma. We've certainly touched on this in the podcast in the past, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's part of a huge collective wave of healing and taking assessment right now that's happening. And my goodness, whether or not you were raised in evangelicism, this country is so deeply formed by Christianity, and a particularly aggressive, oppressive, patriarchal form of Christianity that I think really has been designed to reinforce structures of oppression and control. It's been used at times to justify slavery and genocide of indigenous people, of incarcerating people with lengthy prison sentences, and to silence dissenters who might be questioning abuse of authority. And war, it's a perversion of Christianity, of Christ's message as I understand it. And it's not about a spiritual community, it's about systems of control. We all have wounds from that. That's not to say, of course, that everyone that grew up religious is traumatized, but I definitely know people that were and who have had to do really deep deprogramming as an adult to replace these foundational beliefs about worthiness, about hell, about the right to take up space in your body, in the world, in families, and of course, much worse. There's so much sexual abuse that happens in religious settings where it's too threatening to the power structures for that truth to come to the surface, and the institutions end up holding the institution, of course, over people. Just as I think we're seeing now that governments can end up holding up governments over the needs of its people. So this conversation is such a beautiful microcosm for the macrocosm right now, and I so appreciate that Emily is reaching out into the world to gather stories of people that are doing this kind of healing from purity culture, from the shame around sexuality and pleasure and knowing the body. It's time. And the thing is, the people that are doing this work, that are healing from generations of Christianity wounds, are so valuable to this culture right now. Anybody that as an adult has to assess tightly controlled paradigms that they grew up under, to learn to undo that and write better, loving, connective programming in its place, I mean, that is such powerful work. It tests the basic foundations of reality as you know it and takes you to the depths of who you think you are. And to rebuild from that in your own image is magic. And as a community, we create the safety for one another to do that, to repair these foundational scripts that lead us away from each other and away from ourselves, into shame, into alienation, into fear. I have so much love and respect and admiration for Emily and what she's doing. The way that she's sharing her experience as she's still in process is so courageous and is what all of us have to be doing at this point. The stakes are too high for us not to share what we know as soon as it's safe to do so. So if you're interested in human design, which Emily touches on in this podcast, you can find out a ton about it on her website. And I also suggest you visit the Jovian Archive, which holds the original teachings of its inventor in the 1990s. And I've found it just another really helpful Rorschach, basically. It's tarot, it's astrology, it's a beautiful mirror to look into and have a conversation with your own mind and consciousness, and can be another little key to help unlock ourselves from the cages and return to our innate inner knowing. Okay, I want to read a short poem from Adrienne Rich before I hand it over to Emily. This is a poem she wrote in 1974, and it is called Power. Living in the earth deposits of our history, today a backhoe divulged, out of a crumbling flank of earth, one bottle, amber, perfect, 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy, a tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the element she had purified. It seemed she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died a famous woman, denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. God damn it, I love you, beautiful people. Thank you for sharing what you know, and don't stop. Yeah, well, I want to ask you right off the bat about purity culture, which is not a term that I had heard before reading what you have been sharing recently. So I'm curious if this is something that you have created and how it came to be and how you're approaching it right now.
Yeah, so it's not a term that I created. So the evangelical church is so vast that it's so hard to, like, even when I say evangelical, that could bring like 10 different pictures to 10 different people's minds. But what I'm talking about when I say purity culture is this movement that started around, I think it was the 80s. It was called True Love Waits. Yes, but it's, even when I say purity culture, I'm even like zooming out a bit farther, because my parents and my church never put me through True Love Waits.
Which I assume is like sex after marriage, and you make a commitment to the church and your parents to do that?
Yes, it's True Love Waits is very intense about, waiting until marriage, and sometimes you get a ring to wear, so it like reminds, on your wedding finger, it reminds you to wait until marriage. Sometimes you sign like a little, not a contract, but some sort of a statement that you made with God. There are purity balls, like where like dads will take their daughters to these types of things. Again, none of this was my story, but I have so many friends for whom that it was. Yes, but when I say purity culture, I'm getting a little bit more broad to, like, say, include someone like myself who, although I didn't grow up with True Love Waits, I did grow up with the teaching that waiting until marriage to have sex was the best path. If you didn't do that, there would be a lot of pain, and I would include, like, dress modestly so that you don't tempt boys. That's kind of the flavor of purity culture.
So what denomination did you grow up in?
It was a bit of a mishmash between Southern Baptist and then modern evangelical, like that sort of like hip, like your pastor wears flannel and everyone's cool kind of a thing.
Hipster evangelical.
Yes. So it was kind of a combination of really strict and traditional and then the more loose, like hipster thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And where did you grow up? You didn't grow up in Oregon, did you?
No, we moved around a bit between the South, like Oklahoma and Arkansas, which is where you get that Southern Baptist flavor. But mostly I grew up in South Dakota.
Okay. Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. So what was sort of what were the beliefs that you internalized from the culture and religion that you were raised in as far as your relationship to God and your place in the world?
Wow, yeah. Definitely that the first thing that comes to mind is that we are born sinners. We are not good. But Jesus died on the cross for us so that we could feel. So I'm putting this in very like this is not theology. This is like my emotional perception.
Yeah.
Jesus died on the cross for us so that we could feel good. We could feel like all of our badness was sort of like taken away. But that we still do bad things and all we have to do is pray and ask for forgiveness. There was a huge emphasis on the Bible being 100% a perfect text with no errors, no mistakes, complete truth. It's where you go if you don't know what to do or if you want to know how to live your life.
I assume you had to sort of go through like a human filter to get that truth. Were you encouraged to sit down and read the Bible yourself, or is it like you need somebody in the pulpit telling you what it means?
That's a really good question. It's interesting because I would see my parents more were doing the pulpit thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's my personality or if it's my generation. I would actually read the Bible a lot myself and try to make sense of it. The New Testament, I should say. Mm. But there was obviously like the pastor, like, and it's always a man, the tradition that I come from. He's interpreting the Bible for you and you really don't question what he says. So it was both. It was both for me.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that you got this message that like humans are bad, you are bad, I mean, as a kid, you're basically being conditioned to not trust yourself.
100%. And actually, it's funny that not being able to trust yourself is the part of purity culture that I feel like I'm bringing something new to. Like I'm taking it beyond sexuality and including like, intuition, personal power, the goddess, the feminine. But yeah, not being able to trust yourself was something I 100% internalized. I still see it play out in my life. It's still something I'm working through. But what's interesting is, say, someone like my sister, who's a very strong-willed person and was kind of born that way. I didn't see her struggle with that so much. So I do feel like it really depends on sort of like your constitution. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Are you sort of more like non-confrontational, people-pleasing?
Yes. Since I was more sensitive, non-confrontational, people-pleasing are really good words. I was more willing to just let my mom tell me what to do or let a pastor or even a husband. I was so quick to hand over my power, which again is something I'm like currently unpacking. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what was the beginning of waking up from that?
Do you want me to go down the like waking up from not being a Christian anymore or like waking up to my personal power?
Oh, interesting. Are they, did they feel separate to you?
Kind of.
Wow.
Kind of.
Which came first?
Waking up to not wanting to be Christian anymore.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah. So I was living in Fargo. I was married already at that point. And I had left the evangelical Baptist realm and gone full-blown charismatic.
What is that?
It's really interesting. I would say the charismatics actually do let in the feminine energy, because it was like a very artistic and like people showed all this emotion. People would dance, people would cry. They believe in the modern day miracles, so they're laying hands for healing. They're casting out demons. They're speaking in tongues. Does that kind of painting the picture?
Yeah. So dramatic.
It just felt like a party. It felt more like a party. It didn't feel like church anymore. It was like, oh my God, this is fun and loud and exciting. I do feel like it took Christianity out of my head and dropped it into my heart, I was still very Christian, but I felt like it was step one of bringing it down into the body, which is beautiful, but dangerous for the theology, because then all of a sudden, when your Christianity is embodied, you have to start asking questions like, why would a loving God send people to hell? Because when it's just in the head, you're like, oh, well, because he's perfect and all. You just,
Yeah.
You have all these answers that you've been taught to spit out. You're not really feeling. I started to feel the emotion of like people burning alive for eternity. Like that feels disgusting. And, that's violent. Anyways.
Yeah. So you're like waking up to your complicity almost in this thing that's, or I don't know, complicity is maybe the wrong word, but yeah, I never thought about that before, that when it's embodied, you're actually thinking yourself into that place in a new way.
It was a totally, like in hindsight, to just watch to think about my evolution, it was like, wow, all of a sudden I'd believed in hell since I'd always believed in hell. But the first time that I felt it in my heart, like, whoa, that's so violent, like, ugh. So yeah, I started to talk to my husband, who is from Sri Lanka. His brain is Eastern, so he's a lot more open-minded and mystical by nature because of the Eastern conditioning, right? So I started to confide in him, like, I don't know if I believe in hell, and he would be like, well, that's okay, I kind of don't either. And I was like, what? How have we never talked about this? Yeah, exactly. And then the second really big moment was I was doing the dishes one day, and since I had entered the charismatic church, I was getting a lot more, I was in touch with my intuition. At the time I called it the Holy Spirit, but it's like I could hear this voice in my head giving me little prompts, right? Whereas before I was in the charismatic church, that was sort of blocked off for me for whatever reason. But doing the dishes, and I heard, whether you call it, back then I called it the Holy Spirit. Now I would say, oh, maybe it was like my higher self, or just like spirit in general, right? And this voice said, what does the Bible say about the Bible? And I was like, what? And so, to get a little like technical on you for a second, the New Testament does acknowledge and talk about the Old Testament, right? So the New Testament has a total awareness of the Old Testament, but the New Testament has absolutely no awareness of itself. And because it was never meant to be, so it's a bunch of letters that some, like, I'm not a big historian, but if I'm remembering correctly, it's a bunch of letters that some like Catholic men back in the Rome days decided we should turn this into a book. We should make this a sacred text, right? So it's not like it was being channeled as in like, I am a sacred text right now. No, they were letters written to, I mean, the Gospels were their own thing, but then everything else, like Paul wrote, oh my God, I have not thought about this in a long time, Ephesians or Philippians, those were letters to actual churches. And then later someone decided this will be a sacred text. So yeah, that little voice said, what does the Bible, meaning the New Testament, say about itself? And I just like dropped everything, because it was like this shocking, holy shit moment of, why are we treating this thing like a perfect guide when it isn't even asking us to treat it that way? Does that make sense?
Yeah. it wasn't even created with the intention to be the thing that evangelicals are regarding it as now.
100%. So those were my two big, how could a loving God send people to hell? What does the Bible say about the Bible? Things just started to unravel in an actually really beautiful, slow, non-traumatizing way. Because in 2000, whatever year that was, maybe 2015, all these progressive churches were starting to pop up. So there was still a place for me for a few years to be still a practicing Christian, but asking questions. And so it was like a really slow exiting that felt very like a spiral and very like feminine and safe. You know what I mean?
When you say progressive churches popping up, how would you distinguish that from what you grew up in?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first thing that comes to mind is LGBTQ affirming churches. And I don't just mean like, oh, you guys can come to our church, but you can't be in leadership. I'm talking like a true progressive church will put an LGBTQ person in a leadership position. Like, that's what I mean by progressive, because anything else is just kind of a joke to me. And churches who will put women in leadership, churches who acknowledge climate change, and who will talk about, racism from the pulpit, who don't ignore what's going on in the world. Yeah.
That's interesting, because I recently, my partner grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and because of the pandemic recently, his dad, who is a pastor, was doing like a Zoom. He was preaching virtually, and it was the first time that I have seen an evangelical service, and I was really blown away by like how, I guess it was on point message-wise in terms of being like, now is a time to convert people. People are as confused as ever. Like, go out there and tell them the truth. But I was really surprised at how little it had to do with like the day-to-day of what people are actually dealing with. Of like, yes, go out and preach the message, but what is the message? Like, what are we all doing here together? How are we looking out for each other? And I was really... I was just surprised by how, and not to base the whole evangelical message off of this one experience, but I was shocked at how little it had to do with like this particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, I would call that, and this is my new favorite word, embodiment, but I would call that message, it's disembodied. It's how can we change people's minds about who God is? Because the evangelicalism that I'm most familiar with, it's all about what you believe. Do you believe Jesus is God or not? So that it's in the mind, right? So they preach, I'm sure a lot of churches preach, oh, live a life like Jesus did. But at the end of the day, Christianity would say, it doesn't matter how many good deeds you do. It's, do you believe Jesus is God or not? And that's in the mind. It's like what you just described. It's disembodied.
So then what is that belief even based on then? It's based on like being afraid to disagree, basically, instead of like real direct experience. I don't know, maybe that's not fair.
What's it based on?
Yeah, the belief, if you say, yes, I do believe, but you're not really allowed to explore and test that belief.
There's a lot of fear. Again, speaking from personal experiences, I know a lot of churches are different, but like, there's this like, oh, if you don't believe Jesus is God, you will go to hell. So it's a strange mix of like fear and dogmaticism. And I personally think Jesus's actual message was really beautiful. I believe he was ushering in a new consciousness. I just think humans going forward, culture, patriarchy, capital, everything just messed it up really bad.
They're like, oh, we can use this to control people.
Yeah.
So do you remember what gave you kind of those first little pangs of when you searched for the charismatic church and started shifting? Do you remember what those seeds of doubt were for you and what had been lifelong conditioning at that point?
What I remember is it being like an emotion when it dropped down into the heart of like, say I had a best friend who wasn't Christian. How could I picture her like literally burning for eternity? So it started as that feeling of like, oh my God, what do I actually believe? And how if we say God is love, it was just that like cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
Because, okay, this might be like a tiny tangent.
Please.
But I've been doing this work called Maiden to Mother. It's kind of based off these myths about like Persephone and Inanna and the underworld. I can't speak super eloquently to that, but what I've been learning is how when we kick out goddess, when we kick the feminine out of, say, out of Christianity, when we did that, we removed the body, the personal power that comes from your own intuition, your own authority. So I think that's what the charismatic church unintentionally did for me. It gave me a relationship to my insides. And once you have that, you're gonna ask questions. You can't just be a sheep anymore, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the big theory for why people kicked goddess out and just wanted just Father God, was because then you're taking away body-based knowledge, which is personal power, and all of your power goes outside of you to an authority figure, which is a more masculine way. And I'm not saying the masculine is bad. I'm just saying we need both.
Mm-hmm. So I could hear someone saying, what do you mean we kicked out goddess? Like, where does goddess belong in Jesus's world?
Yeah. So this might be a little bit fumbly because I'm so excited about this research, but I'm just like tasting it. Basically it goes back to like witch hunts and like goddess, you know, is of the earth, takes care of the earth, and there's like a reverence for earth. It's not linear, it's not logical, it's cyclical and just the way Christianity came about. I've heard it called like the father tongue versus like the mother tongue, and the father tongue is like logic and it needs evidence and it needs proof, and only what you see is real. It's materialistic, right? The power is outside of yourself. Like someone else has to tell you what to do, which sometimes we need that. We need that when we're raising children or when we're running a company. Sometimes we need structure and hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't need to completely kick out goddess, which is like making decisions off of intuition or emotion, seeing things in a non-linear way. Because one of the big things I've been exploring lately is how there's this Bible verse, I think it's in the Old Testament, and it talks about how the heart is deceitful and you can't trust it.
Oof.
Yeah, and I can't remember how many times that was preached to say, like, don't trust your emotions.
So emotions and God have nothing to do with each other in that worldview.
Sort of. It's a bunch. Honestly, it's a bunch of cognitive dissonance, because they would say like, oh, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor, but don't trust. You know, if your emotions are leading you into sin, don't trust that. It was a lot of confusion. And just like, where is your internal, do you have an internal compass, or is the Bible my compass? Where is my compass? That's sort of where I ended up. Yeah.
So I didn't grow up in a religious paradigm, but I grew up with a very strong parent. And I can relate to you in this process of like waking up to your own compass. And I want to ask you, like, as beautiful and life-saving as that has been for me, I also know that there's been a lot of like fear in that process and heartbreak of like breaking down all the things that I thought were true and that I needed. So I'm curious if, as you've come into your own self-knowledge, if there's been loss along with that.
Oh my goodness, yeah, like so much. And again, I see the spiralness of like waking up to my own power is something. I feel like it probably started when I was in college, but it would like circle back around in different ways. Like I even think it like changed my relationship with my mom for a while. Like we've since rekindled. But as soon as I didn't look to her for everything or take what she said as truth, there would be sort of a strange thing between us.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like right now, especially, I'm really going into this internal compass self-trust work, and I feel like I'm wandering around in the dark, and it's so scary. And yeah, there is lots of grief. There's lots of loss. There's like a complete lack of structure and safety and security right now that I know I will be rebuilding.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's definitely not for the faint of heart, but I think it's the most rewarding thing you can do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So do you have touch points or practices now that help you kind of anchor in as you're doing this incredibly ungrounding work?
Yeah. One thing, I do use human design. Do you want me to explain what that is?
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty new to me, so I'm actually really excited to glean your wisdom on this.
Yeah. It's the easiest way to describe it is you get a chart, so you could picture almost similar to an astrological, like a birth chart. It combines astrology, the chakra system, the I Ching, and the Kabbalah. And the reason I brought it up is because there are 5 types, and each type has a strategy for making decisions. And mine is in my gut. So to bring it back to the question, one practice I'm working on is like really trying to feel my gut yes and my gut no, which is it's really simple, but it's actually kind of hard. It's one of those things that's so simple that it's hard.
Yes.
Yep. Another thing I've been trying to do is cut out a lot of the noise. Like, I'm someone who wants to like listen to podcasts and read books and read Instagram posts like all the time to try and figure out what I should do. And I think there's a time and place for that. But I'm in a place where I'm like, how do I just make a lot more quiet space so that I can hear and receive guidance? Embodiment work. I think embodiment work is really the only way, and this might sound dogmatic, but I do think it's like the only way we can build self-trust that's sustainable, because if you're not in your body, you're just spinning in your mind, and your mind's going to take you all kinds of places, like fear, old patterns. Oh, what did this person tell me to do? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I personally use dance to do embodiment work and yoga, but dance feels really feminine because I do it like improvisational style, like no choreography. I just turn on the music and let my body move, because then you're building new neural pathways of like quieting the mind and letting the body lead. You're building that like surrender muscle.
Yeah, that is I'm trying to do it more and more because I'm very inhibited in that way. And every time I let myself do it, I end up crying. And I'm just like, oh man, I'm holding so much in here. I don't even know. Like, I need to be visiting this space very often.
Yep. I often end up telling my clients, you might cry or you might laugh when you do this, but you're just moving emotion. Like, it's okay.
Mm.
I always warn people that you might cry. And it really happens that I cry anymore, but at first, because you're really unlocking stuff. I put in a grounding cord, like in a meditation, like connect my root chakra to the earth. That's something I try to do for this work.
What do you experience when you do that?
So basically, when you sit down to go into meditation, you picture your root chakra, which is at the base of your spine. It's just like an energy center within the body. And then you can picture like some people do tree roots. I do like a cord, kind of like an empty pipe. You connect it to your root chakra, and then you send it just in your mind's eye, send it down through the thing you're sitting on, through the floor, into the earth, through all the layers of the earth, and then you attach it to the center of the earth. Mm-hmm. I usually immediately feel like my shoulders relax, because that's where I carry a lot of tension. Yeah, and then what you're doing is you're acknowledging, okay, anything that's not mine is leaving my body, my aura, and being soaked up by the earth. So you're just clearing out, clearing out, clearing out, clearing out. It's a great practice. Everyone should do it every day, I think.
You seem like a pretty empathetic person. Are you absorbing a lot of external energy as you go through your day?
Yes. Yes. Even in human design, my emotions are open. So I won't even know what emotions are mine and what aren't. So clearing that out is really helpful I think for anyone, but especially for people who have a lot of openness in their chart. Or if I'm speaking astrology, I think people who have a lot of like water or maybe a lot of air would want to clear out.
So that you can listen to that inner voice.
Yeah, totally. And so you're not carrying around other people's pain. And voices, just all of it. And I know there's like a place for like community and like running things by your friends. But I know in my journey, for example, when I would go out with my friends, like I would be so used to looking to either my mom or the church. And then even after I left the church, I would look to my husband to tell me what to do. And I didn't realize it was so bad until I was out with my friends a couple months ago. We were having margaritas, and after my first one, the waitress came and asked if I wanted another one. And I looked at my friends.
Yeah.
And they just looked back at me, and I was like, should I have another one? And they just looked at me and they're like, that's your decision. And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? So yeah, for me, emptying out and like centering myself is like really important work based on like my past behaviors.
Wow. Okay, so I'm starting to get a picture of where sensuality plays into this, but I'd love to hear what that unfolding has been like for you, a new relationship to your body in a sexual way as well.
Oh, yeah, where to begin on that? So the churches I grew up in, they wouldn't shy away from talking about sex, but it was obviously talked about and like, oh, this is a temptation you'll feel, but wait until marriage. And then once you're married, you can do whatever you want. Like, you can have this glorious sex life, you know. It was very like enticing the way they presented it about how great it would be after you got married. And the way I saw a lot of girls younger, and I'm also just picturing like in college, the way they would show up in their bodies, I would notice they were really, so can I speak sort of like in like archetypal
Please.
language? Yeah. So they would show up very much in say like the mother or the nurturer, because that's a safe way to be as a Christian woman. Like, oh, I can be like sweet. You can be pretty. There's nothing wrong with being pretty, but you're sweet and you're a bit reserved, and I would almost say their bodies were a bit like stiff, right?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up with like my actual mom. She's quite feisty, quite liberal compared to all my other friends' Christian moms, which is beautiful. Like, she's amazing. She'd really like been around the block in her life, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And she always like let my sister and I push a lot of what would be seen as boundaries in the church. Like, she let us wear really short shorts. We did dance growing up, and when we were doing dance, there was so much like pelvic thrusting and, you know, freedom in the body, and that was never shut down by my mom, which is really beautiful. And so I started to notice the way I feel like that men, so this is college, so men, boys, whatever they are. We're not really sure. The way they would react to me, or like I would see like a few other women who would hold this like a lot more like, yeah, sensuality and like freedom in their bodies, even though I was still the good girl, quote unquote, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there was a difference, and I would talk really openly about like periods and certain things about sex, and see, where am I going with this? I was just always strange. And I would see a few other women here and there in the church that were what I would say holding this archetype of more like the dark feminine. And I mean, I was maybe holding like 2% of her dark feminine. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to like feel different and to be looked at slightly differently, right? Maybe the men were sexualizing me. I don't know. Or maybe they felt really nurtured by the dark. I have no idea what was going on in their heads. Mm-hmm. So then I would form these women's groups, these Bible studies that would turn just more into hangouts. And I, again, would like talk about like bodies and sensuality. So there was just always this theme of like a little bit more freedom for me. And then I became the person who Christian women would come to and they would be like, I'm doing this with my boyfriend. Like they would tell me how far they were going sexually. And they would be like, is this okay? Or the ones who maybe didn't care so much about the rules, they would even want to like ask questions about sex. You know, I was the person that could hold the secrets of how like sexual they were being or come to for that kind of advice. But it's really interesting though, because in that space, I was liberated. But it's like once I left the church, I was the more repressed one when it came to like the grander scheme of society. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. How would you notice that?
So say like in a workspace, suddenly I almost look like the one who's dressing more modestly or who's not as free in my body. Who maybe gets uncomfortable. I mean, this doesn't make me uncomfortable now, but if a coworker a few years back had like maybe talked about having a threesome, all my alarm bells would go off, you know, like bad, like no. Mm-hmm. So the journey of sensuality, again, it's like a spiral, because as soon as you, or with anything, as soon as you've evolved and like you're on, quote, not on top, but you're the outsider, then I feel like it loops you back around and it wants you to like upgrade again and again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the most current evolution, my husband and I got interested in Tantra and went to a Tantra festival where, again, like a lot of women are going around topless. And I was like, that's not what I'm going to do here. So just seeing again, oh, I'm the more reserved person in this group. Whereas most of my friends would never go to a festival to begin with. That's just like a funny thing. And then I found a dance class recently called S Factor, which is all about feminine movement. There are no mirrors. The lights are really low. So you, like I kind of explained earlier, you just move to the music. Mm-hmm. And it is more like erotic in nature.
What do you mean by that?
Like the few moves that she does teach you, it's like pole dancing without the pole. Mm-hmm. So your body is kind of always shaped like an S. So either like your ass is pushed out and your chest is pushed out, or maybe like your hip is to one side and your shoulders are to another. Like you're always moving like an S. And there's someone who sits in a chair. So you always have a witnesser and you're focusing your energy on them. Yeah, it's very intense and interesting. So there's like an energetic exchange. It's another woman from your class. It's not like, there's no polarity.
That sounds so safe, like a really safe way to be free.
What's funny is it's really, really safe, and that's the intention. But what I noticed is I clam up. A fear takes over. I clam up. It's really challenging for me. It's not that way for all the girls. So it's funny. I'm like, is this my Christian programming? Is this my marriage programming? I'm like, what is coming up in my body right now that's so scared to do this thing? But it is really safe. That's the design for sure. Yeah.
I mean, I can relate to that too. I mean, I grew up in a pretty progressive culture, but I still have a lot of hesitation about taking up space. And that can even include like inside my own body. So, and feel free to tell me that this is too intimate a question, but what was it like for you when you started having sex?
No, definitely not too intimate. So I did not wait until marriage. I feel like I have to say that because of like all the constructs that I set up. What's interesting is, yeah, I became sexually active with a boyfriend in college, and it felt very like safe. Like, I think maybe because I was a little bit older, my brain was a little more developed. I think I was like, 18, 19, and he was a really nice guy. We had a heart connection. There was so much trust that honestly, it was just really, really playful and pleasurable and fun. But I would always feel guilty afterwards because of, I knew I, quote unquote, I was sinning. But because of my particular upbringing, I just needed to like go to church and ask for forgiveness, or pray and ask for forgiveness. Whereas, like, I think I might be a little off on this, but I feel like Catholics and charismatics, it would be a little heavier for them. But like for me, it was like, well, I'm doing this bad thing, but Jesus died for me and he'll forgive me. But I would do it over and over. And I would say in that relationship, there was no shame. Shame came later because I did not marry that man. Right. Mm-hmm. So because I was a virgin, there was no acknowledged shame with him. It was just like the guilt that would come from a very I broke a rule place.
Yeah, I'm glad you just said that word virgin, because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and just the idea that like virginity is a construct. I mean, yes, there is a physiological component, but it's such an ideology.
I'm even surprised that I said that. I mean, it's in my consciousness, but no, I completely agree. It's a total construct. Yep.
And it's, of course, disproportionately aimed at women or females, female bodies.
Yep. I personally believe that women are far more traumatized by purity culture than men. And I'm not saying men can't be traumatized by it, but women come out so much more disconnected from their pleasure and their sensuality from what I've seen.
Yeah, why is that? I mean, why do women bear the burden of that?
I think that because there's this unspoken... So again, I talk in like metaphor and like trying to capture the essence of something. There's this unspoken like innocence and honestly like purity and preciousness that is placed on women in the church. Like, oh, you're this beautiful thing. And then when that happens, all of a sudden, if you're not married, you're a slut, or it changes so quickly.
You're broken.
Whereas with men in the church or boys, I only see it as a rule. Like, don't do this. There's not all this like, oh, you're pure and you're this flower. It's just literally like, this is the rule, don't do it. There's not all this characterization or these like adjectives put on them. Mm-hmm. And I honestly think the boys will be boys thing does translate to Christianity. It's a bit unspoken, but it's like, oh, haha, like when we were going through our premarital counseling, this pastor was like, well, because men want sex so much more than women, which isn't true. So in the church, there's this thing of like, oh yeah, boys, they're so sexual and they're going to try really hard not to break the rules, but who knows what's going to happen. It's all unspoken, but I feel like it's there.
So women just become these material objects that have something to protect.
Yeah. There's so much more stuff piled up so that when women have sex before marriage, Christians, I feel like there's this cataclysmic shame spiral. It's like an identity crisis.
Oof.
I would love to maybe hear from some men on this, but I don't know if that happens to them.
Yeah. So when shame came into your life, what was that like?
Yes, lovely. So that came when I started dating my now husband. It was just so difficult for my internal world to deal with the fact that I wasn't a quote unquote virgin. And I wasn't really ready. I knew I walked around knowing that I had sex and that I was still Christian and I still wanted to get married. And in my mind, it was like, oh, no big deal. Like, my future husband will understand, like, he'll love me anyways. That's the story that played out. But the community that he and I were a part of, they believed in like telling your entire sexual past to the person you're going to marry, just so they know, and so they can kind of decide if they want to like deal with it or not. Sad. So yeah, he asked me really early on, like maybe a few weeks in to date. Oh, I don't know if it was weeks or months, because that was his belief. That was what he had learned was best, right? Mm. Yeah, he asked me to tell him, and I was like, no. That's like private information. I mean, I'm willing to tell you, like, okay, I've had sex with 2 people, mm-hmm. you know, or I've had 2 like penises in me, whatever. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, sex is very blurry, mm-hmm. in my opinion, like what is and isn't sex. But in my brain at that time, I was like, okay, I've had sex with 2 people, and he felt that he needed to know more, and I was like, no. So it was that's when the shame came, because I'm like, why should I bear this? It's almost felt like I was being asked to like humiliate myself in front of the one person who I care about, who thinks of me the most. Mm-hmm. And that was like an ongoing, that took like years to really, before he and I were really like rid of that, for lack of, I don't know, darkness mm-hmm. that then existed in our relationship. It took years.
Wow. Yeah.
It's such an intimate, vulnerable space to talk about what you've done when you feel like what you've done was impure and unacceptable and dirty. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's inherent judgment. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where a lot of my passion around purity culture, whatever it is I'm birthing around that, the passion comes from like, I've been able to overcome that shame. I can have a lot of pleasure sensually, sexually, and feel very free. I'm sure there's more work to do, but you know, I see the huge, huge difference between then and now. And so my passion is like, for anyone who's still stuck in the shame and they maybe can't even experience pleasure or freedom in their bodies, like how do we move them when they're ready into that space?
Wow. What an incredible mission.
Yeah, thank you. It excites me.
So I know you've been talking to people. Can you share a little bit about, I know your project is very much underway, which is actually so exciting. I'm curious how you opened it to the world and what you've been learning.
Yeah. I basically just made a thing on my Instagram stories, and I was like, who grew up in purity culture? Who wants to talk about it with me privately? And the response was overwhelming. People are very eager because, as far as I know, there's only one book out there. I think it's called Pure. And she interviews a bunch of women, but she doesn't offer any solutions. You're kind of left with like, okay, well, now what? Mm-hmm. So I've been having these like 30-minute calls with women. And what I'm finding, usually each person says something that touches on something that's so unique and powerful, something I never would have thought of. Mm-hmm. And so that's been really beautiful. But then also there are a few very common threads. One of them is whenever I ask, like, what were you talked to or taught about pleasure? And everyone says nothing. Like, absolute, like, and I don't necessarily even mean, like, I mean, I do mean female sexual pleasure anatomically. I mean that, but I also mean, like, even broader than that. Because, you know, if you're present enough, moving around in water can feel like pleasure. Mm-hmm. Eating a piece of chocolate slowly can feel like pleasure. So I'm kind of like thinking both broad and specific female sexual pleasure, but they're just like nothing. Like that's not even a concept really. Or they said like if they hear the word pleasure in church or stuff, it's somehow seen as like bad. That was a very common thread.
Mm-hmm. I feel that in culture at large because of like our puritanical roots in general. I think we're still like standing on those foundational building blocks culturally. And I mean, I relate to that too, again, as a person that didn't grow up in a specific religion. Like just pleasure is like, oh, that's dangerous. That'll take you down a path of ruin if you're not super careful. It's just we're not taught that there's intelligence in in pleasure.
You're absolutely right. Because I do think, again, I'm not that great with history, but like America was birthed with very Christian.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yep.
Sorry, I think I cut you off. You were about to say something else that you'd noticed.
I noticed that for girls who were sexually active at a younger age, like say in high school, they would tell me like, oh, I felt like I couldn't talk to my parents or even just my own mom because it was so heavily taught, like, don't do this. So then once they did it, they felt like they had to keep it a secret.
Mm-hmm.
And just like feeling that lack of support at such a young age. And who knows how a mom would have reacted. Could have been good, could have been bad, but even just that feeling of we can't talk about this. Mm. And then of course, so much disembodiment came up, which none of them used that word, but one of them was like talking about her eating disorder, mm-hmm. that she connects to the body is bad. One girl felt like even dropping into her gut to feel her gut response, like that was too scary. Mm. And then lastly, I think a common thread that came up was around sexual abuse or rape. Not all of them had experienced that, but almost everyone brought up this philosophy of like, if you have sex before marriage, you're impure. What does that mean for someone who it wasn't their choice?
Yeah, God, that sucks.
Like they're going to feel impure. On top of all the other trauma that comes from that experience, they're going to feel, damaged, impure. Can I share like an analogy that some people who teach purity culture use?
Yeah.
Just to like show quite how damaging this concept is. Yeah, when my husband and I were going through all of our shame stuff, it was causing a lot of conflict, obviously, I think we were just engaged at this point. And it was causing so much conflict between us because I would feel, no matter what was going on from him, I felt so exposed. It just felt exposed and yucky and it wasn't safe, you know? Mm-hmm. So I told him, I was like, we need help. We need to talk to someone. Mm-hmm. And we were so young that like therapy wasn't even on our radar. Like I was 23. You don't usually like go out and pay for a therapist at that age, at least where I'm from. So we're like, oh, we'll talk to our pastors. So we set up a meeting with the pastor and his wife, and she has no idea that I had sex before marriage. She just knows me. She just kind of knew the gist of it, right? And she told me this story about like this analogy of like a gift. Like she wanted to put on this conference for women to help them live by like godly standards sexually and stuff. And she's like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't think this was her idea. I think this is something people do a lot in America. You wrap a gift. So you have a little box. You wrap it with like really pretty wrapping paper and you tie a bow around it, all that stuff. And you hand it to the first person in the audience and she unwraps it and then wraps it back. And then you pass it to the next girl and she unwraps it and wraps it back. And I don't know how many times you do this, but basically the analogy is like your virginity is a gift. And if you give it away, or not your virginity, I guess, your body, your sexuality is a gift. If you give it away to like all these different people, by the time it gets to your husband, you know, you can picture this gift that's been unwrapped and rewrapped. It's not pretty anymore. It's like ripped up and crinkled and, you know, you get the picture, right? Mm. So she's telling me this, not knowing that I had sex with two other people before. God. And I'm kind of okay. Like, I mean, I'm triggered, but I'm not going into like trauma, right? Mm. I think I'm pissed is what I am. And I'm like, woman, like, can you imagine if she had said this to a sexual abuse victim? Mm-hmm. Like, I just don't understand how people get so into their dogma. They don't think about, and, you know, it's their programming. I don't, you know, there's so many nuances. I'm not saying everyone who believes that stuff is bad, but those teachings are so damaging.
So alienating.
Yeah.
Man, you've been on such a long journey. It gives me like so much love and compassion for the work you're doing and how transparent you are too. How does that feel?
I mean, I think that some of the stuff I've said on this is probably the most publicly transparent that I've been, where, like, say people who I don't know will be hearing this. But if you get me, like, even if you're a complete stranger, you get me one-on-one at a coffee shop, I will tell you, like, almost anything. Which did drive my husband crazy for a while because he's a very private person. But yeah, I don't know. There's so many people on the journey. There are people who are still in the church and they want to stay there. There are people who are fully liberated. But I'm so passionate about that in-between stage because it's so confusing.
You're talking about the in-between stage of, like, looking outside of you for an authority to looking inside?
Yes, which would, I think, include rewriting your whole story about sexuality too.
Uh-huh.
So I think my transparency is, like, passion for, like, hey, are you going through this? Hit me up. You know, kind of my story is part of the passion of wanting to, like, serve those people, I guess. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting. I'm similar in that if somebody asks me a question, I will answer it honestly. And I think, yeah, very much it comes from that place of just wanting to communicate, like, you're not alone. I see you, and you're not alone. And I think there's something in that for the people that have done that for me, like, it just makes me feel like this moment is okay. I'm okay. Whatever has happened is okay because here we are talking about it. And yeah, I feel that in your signal of just like, we're all here and you're beautiful and worthy and I see you.
Yeah. And you just made me think I should add, sometimes I get tunnel vision. The more I talk to people, I'm realizing these issues are not just happening with women who grew up in the church. There are plenty of women who didn't grow up in the church who have a hard time surrendering to pleasure or who don't feel sexy. So I just want to, like, I guess, acknowledge that I get really caught up in, like, the church part because I think I'm so passionate. But like we said, our whole puritanical culture, I think that it affects someone who's never been to church in their life could struggle with how to be sensual, how to feel sexy, how to surrender to pleasure, you know?
Well, it's so disorienting because, of course, we live in what's actually like a hyper-sexualized culture and see, like, I remember being a tween and seeing pictures of, like, Christina Aguilera and Jessica Simpson. And, like, on one hand, I knew, like, ugh. But on the other hand, I also was like, I'm not that. I don't know how to be that. And that holds power over me in a way because it's something that I don't know how to do it, and it's clearly, like, revered. And that was a mind fuck for quite a while of being, like, resentful of it at the same time as being like, I don't understand. And what happened is, like, I went out in the world. I moved to New York when I was 18 years old. I discovered, like, alcohol and figured out that, like, I could wield my sexual power over men and just went crazy. Because I was like, oh, I'm figuring out how to do the thing, and, you know, had to go through that to figure out that it wasn't actually serving me.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So there's so much. So this is, like, totally nothing to do with Christianity or purity culture, but like you said, femininity. Because I remember the first bra that my mom got me, I was probably like 12 or 13, kind of like a real bra, like not a sports bra. And it had a little pink, it was all white, and it had a little pink bow in the middle. And I took scissors and I cut off the bow. Because, I mean, I wasn't a tomboy by any means, but I was, like, very much rejecting, like, pink or, like, bow. I think it was, like, an unconscious, like, femininity is weak kind of even though I was a very feminine person. And then when my husband and I first started to deconstruct Christianity, I cut my hair off really short, which I felt like was this unconscious, like, again, rejection of what other people thought femininity was. But now that I'm not coming from a place of rebellion, I'm coming from a place of, like, just my soul. My hair's very long. I love lipstick. I love lace. Like, and it's actually what I like. It just so happens that it might fit into what culture says is feminine, but it doesn't matter to me either way because it's coming from, like, within. yeah, I think everyone has to go through that journey. Even like, I like to wear crop tops. I like to show off my stomach, but now it's not coming from a place of, like you described. I used to use that to feel powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to go through a period of rejecting it all. And then now it's like, oh, this is just my expression. And it's actually okay. If someone sexualizes me, they do. If they don't, they don't. I can't really control that.
But they're just holding it. Yeah. I like that a lot. I think about that Ram Dass thing a lot, where he's like, hippies create cops, cops create hippies, which is like, not to take away from the fact that there are like oppressive forces in the world, but it's like, if you're locked into an antagonistic relationship, you're inherently giving away your power to the thing that you're responding to.
Yeah. That's really powerful. Wow. Yeah. Yep. I'm reading Glennon Doyle's book, Untamed.
Yes.
Yeah. And she has this sentence, like, I won't quote it word for word, but it's something like, rebellion is just another cage. Like, following the rules is a cage, but pure rebellion can be a cage as well.
Wow.
It's exactly what you said. So she talks about, like, what you want to do is be original, not rebellious. And I mean, I think there's a place for rebellion, but I think she means, like, if you're living in that spirit 24/7, you know?
Mm-hmm. It'll sap you. Mm-hmm. What is I know you said you don't think of your intuitive voice anymore as the Holy Spirit. I'm curious what your current cosmological relationship is to God and yourself.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. It's so ambiguous, but so after I left the church, I was atheist for a year because I was angry.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of made me a little bit depressed. I realized I need mysticism in my life just to feel happy and excited. And so I just dabbled in, like, New Age, and now I kind of play with maybe, like, two things. I think there's, like, my higher self, which I would still say is, like, within me. And then I do kind of have this, like, the universe or spirit. And I sort of think of it as both inside of me and outside of me. I love, like, tantric philosophies that talk about how everything we do is divine. Like, Tantra would even say, like, pooping is divine. I don't know, whatever terrible thing, not terrible, but, like, like, mundane, whatever thing you can think of. So I love that, like, the full human experience is divine. I'm not a fan of any spirituality that wants you to leave your body, unless it's just for a time. Like, okay, let's do a journey, or, like, let's astral project, but only, like, every once in a while, you know? I think the emphasis needs to be in the body and how the human experience is in and of itself divine. I recently got the message, like, maybe a couple weeks ago, that I should start, like, praying again. And I was like, what? Like, to whom? I think because I grew up Christian, that feels like a little bit like a mild trigger.
Yeah.
But I talked to my friend about it, and she's like, no, it's just, think of it as just like a mantra or a spell cast. Like, it can be much more fluid, and it's more the act of, she explained this, and I think this is what Spirit is asking of me. When you pray, you're showing, like, trust and surrender, and that you feel supported by something.
Yes.
So I think that's the vibration, because I'm also working through a lot of, like, lack mentality and, like, money stuff. So yeah, I'm being pushed towards, like, trust and surrender and feeling safe and supported. Very, like, root chakra things. Relationship to, like, spirit or God. I'm just so open for it to continue to reveal itself to me. I can't ever, like, pinpoint something.
Yeah, I like that. It's interesting. I went on a long walk with a friend the other day, and he was saying pretty much the same thing. Like, he felt kind of this spiritual barrenness in his life, and I was asking him about prayer. He grew up, I want to say Methodist, maybe, is not practicing anymore, and he was like, yeah, prayer, but prayer to who? Prayer to what? I feel like I'm faking it. And I was like, the funny thing is, I kind of feel like faking it has worked for me, because it's like, if I put my life into the hands of something, it inherently brings into being whatever the something is. And I don't even need to have, like, a totally specific picture of what it is, but it's like even just starting with gratitude and saying, thank you for this thing that I'm experiencing right now, and recognizing that a lot of times the gifts in my life are things that I wanted a month ago or a week ago, or even sometimes like 10 years ago. Like, oh, this is the kind of relationship that I wanted to be in, but it took me 10 years to like mature to the point where I could even be in this kind of relationship. And in the process of saying, thank you, I'm grateful for this thing, it brings into being a kind of magic where my current reality is like visions and prayers from the past being answered and manifested. And before I even really knew what I was doing, I was building a universe made of magic around me. And it has been like teaching me as I've been doing it, I guess.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. That's kind of, so especially for anyone who maybe like came from a similar background as me. I mentioned this earlier, this like maiden mother crone, Persephone Inanna myth. I almost just want to point people to the woman I'm talking about. She's on Instagram and her handle is the Mother Spirit. So this maiden to mother stuff that I've been digesting from her, it is very like goddess focused. And at the end of the day, I would say God or spirit is totally, doesn't have a gender. But when you spent 20, 30 years in a male steeped God, patriarchal religion, it can be so healing to overcorrect and do the opposite. So yeah, like if I'm feeling really, really down, what I've been learning from this woman is like, you can call upon the mother, which is like the goddess, and you can like ask her to hold you. You can even talk to yourself. I could say like, I'm sad. So that's like me talking. And then I can reply to myself as the mother and say, why are you sad? My heart is broken. Why is your heart broken? Just to get sort of the emotion moving. Mm-hmm. So I have found that like, yeah, thinking of a feminine God, not as a truth, but as a, I guess, a practice has actually been really healing compared to like where I came from.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, thank you. Has your relationship to masculinity changed as you've been healing the feminine?
Oh, wow. So it's funny. I did a live yesterday with this woman and she totally schooled me. I mean, she wasn't, I don't know if I'm using that word properly. I kept bringing up the divine feminine and then she started talking about the divine masculine and it was like, she put me in my place. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Energetically. She was just talking, but I felt my whole body be like, Emily, sit down and listen. I feel like my insides on this are all muddled, but if I had to guess, I think I have a lot of healing to do around the masculine, like a lot. I notice that if something comes out of a man's mouth, I'm so triggered, but if the same thing comes out of a woman's mouth, I might not be. So I have some work to do there.
Wow. Yeah. I can definitely clock that in myself too. And I think I hear some of the overcorrection in myself, like you're saying, of going so deeply into the feminine. And I think it's a necessary stage of healing and evolution, but I've also been asking the universe for help seeing the divine masculine around me, just feeling like I don't want to just assume that I'm living in toxic patriarchy all the time and everywhere. Like, please help me see it so that I can develop a healthy relationship with it. But kind of like you're saying, it's very much, I'm at the beginnings and not fully into the takeaways of it yet.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to give you a chance to share some of the healing work that you offer and how you do that as you've been healing yourself, how you've been sharing that with others.
So right now it all comes through Human Design PDX, which is my God, it feels so weird to say that out loud. I guess it's what I say, my company. I don't know, my business.
Yes.
So I read Human Design charts, and I people can probably hear it weaved throughout the podcast. I have future visions of holding sessions for women that have nothing to do with human design, that just have to do with sensuality and stuff. But those are still being like, those are like in the conception. It's still like in the belly, in the womb, you know? So what I have right now are sensuality human design readings where I take your chart, and I usually like people to tell me like, what's your intention with this reading? Because everyone is so different. Like one woman I worked with, it was pretty much what you and I have talked about. She just wanted to feel more confident and sexy and have more pleasure, right? But a different woman, she wanted to talk about her relationship with her boyfriend. She couldn't figure out the energetics. Another woman is in the process of leaving her husband, so it was much more about like grief. So it's really, I'm just really open to talk about anything of the heart, emotions, intuition, sexuality, sensuality in these central embodiment readings. But I take your chart, and for some reason, when I look at it through the lens of sensuality, all these archetypes pop out at me. And that doesn't happen when I look at a chart for like a normal reading. It's so bizarre. So there's something that wants to be channeled through these sensuality readings, right? So these archetypes will pop up that are very specific to you, to your chart. So I teach people, well, we pick one. I'm like, which one do you want to work with? And I kind of teach them how to embody it so they can start to make an actual physical, chemical, cellular change by doing archetypal work.
Could you give an example of what you mean by finding archetypes in a chart?
Sure, yeah. So for example, if people have gate 19 and gate 25, which are, I don't know if this is going to just sound like mumbo jumbo to people, but it's like saying, oh, if your moon is in Cancer and your Venus is in Virgo, whatever. So if you have gate 19 and gate 25, the quality of those gates together, I call it the tantrika, or the tantrika, because it's very much about like touch and the senses, and it's very like energetic and spiritual and wants to transcend. That's one example. Another example would be like, if you have gate 59, I would maybe say like, oh, the seductress, because gate 59 is very just like purely sexual, and it does want to seduce. If you have gate 45 mixed with gate 22, I would be like, oh, the queen. That's the queen, you know? Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah.
There's like the siren, the creatrix, there's so many. And I give like a song that goes with each archetype so you can invoke her in a more physical way. So yeah, those are I have other readings too. There's like for creatives, Saturn return, there's a bunch of different stuff, but I'm very lit up about the sensual embodiment ones. I get the most playful, and I kind of go rogue, and it really caters to you.
Yeah, I want to get one. Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, you are so generous with your story and your time. I'm really, just so grateful that you're in the world and talking about this, because I think people are really ready to shift a lot of these wounds, and it's like, where to start? And you're really shining a light on that path, I think.
Thank you. If people want to share their purity culture story with me, they can reach out to my Emily Vino Instagram. Right now, that's just looked like someone hopping on a call with me and telling me their story, and I don't even necessarily do anything with the information. It's just I'm gathering stories.
It sounds really cathartic just to be able to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you. This is so lovely. I feel just like very in my body from talking to you. I'm really grounded.
Good.
So yeah,
thank you
so
for
much.
having me.
I consciously died. A saint do on a road, a saint a double rainbow. I got a complicated soul. To me this city's hell, but I know you call it home. I was made for the green, made to belong. The clouds are passing by on by, my darling. Your eyes are breathing. I've seen them in the light, and I couldn't let it go, no matter how hard I was trying. The clouds are passing by. I've been called heartbreaker for doing justice to my own. I too been a fault finder, but that life is broke. Now I love you. Oh, you're the one my heart chose, and so I will be here, and so I will be here, beyond this line, beyond all fear, beyond this life, beyond all fear. The clouds are passing by on by, my dear. Your eyes are breathing. I've seen them in their eyes.
Ooh, I just had to let that play out. If you don't know, that's Julie Byrne, and her music is magic. She's a medicine woman and has definitely accompanied me on many a journey. Okay, you know what to do. Find Emily online, emilyvino.com and humandesignpdx.com. She's also on Instagram under both of those names. Her personal name for illustration and purity culture, and Human Design PDX for getting your reading done. I love you. More soon. I'm putting out a short film this week, and I can't wait to share it with you.